Hiring managers, what's the most strangest thing a candidate did? We had a girl come in for an interview who brought her boyfriend. He didn't wait in the car. He actually wanted to sit in on the interview with her. When I explained that it wasn't protocol and he'd have to at least wait in the break room, he actually got angry at me. She wasn't a bad candidate, but I didn't want to risk anything to do with her boyfriend bleeding into our office. Edit. Letters were missing in words.
That's a strange situation. Bringing someone to an interview is unusual. I get wanting support, but it makes things complicated. I can see why you decided it wasn't a good idea to have him in the room. Sometimes you have to set boundaries for the sake of the workplace. It might have affected the interview, even if she seemed fine. Just one of those moments you deal with, I guess.
My first management job in IT, it was around 2001 or so. Hiring a General Windows / Solaris sysadmin. One guy comes in with a huge backpack. Do the interview, he's clearly on the spectrum, but I like him okay. Pretty smart, functional. As he's leaving, I casually ask, "What's in your bag?" He then explains that it's mostly O'Reilly books that he brings to all his interviews, so he can prove people wrong if he needs to.
That's an interesting approach for an interview. Carrying around books to back himself up shows he was prepared. The guy seemed to have his own way of handling things, which is cool. It's always good to find someone who thinks differently and can hold their own. A bit unconventional, but it might have been what set him apart from the others.
Me. Can you tell me about the gap in 2010 and 12? Them. I took time out to work on myself, me. Okay, so can you tell me why you left your last position? Them. I was asked to leave, and I have to disclose this, I embezzled from them. Me. So, did you work on yourself in prison between 2010 to 2012? Them. I don't think that's important. Now, I Google people every single time before I interview them. Smiley face.
It's interesting how people can have such different stories. This friend's honesty was surprising but kind of made sense. The gap they mentioned seems significant, yet it's weird how they brush off the details of the embezzlement. Guess it shows that not everyone is upfront about their past, and sometimes you definitely learn to be cautious. Now I understand the importance of researching before any interviews.
I interview at least 5 potential caregivers a week to work with seniors that have dementia. We don't ask the typical job interview questions. We ask them a series of common scenarios they will encounter and see how they react/respond. One of the questions is, what would you do if you walk into a client's room and they start screaming at you to get out? The correct answer is some variation of leave for a few minutes and come back with a big smile on your face, and usually they will be happy to see you. One caregiver said she would bear hug the client into submission because she doesn't tolerate any disrespect. When I tried telling her that's the opposite of what you should do, she replied, no, I would stick with the bear hug.
It's interesting how people approach caregiving. The bear hug response caught me off guard. You'd think compassion matters in that job. I guess some folks just miss the mark completely. The idea of forcing affection on someone in distress is pretty off. It's wild to see how different personalities can shape the way they deal with tough situations, especially with vulnerable people. That lady probably won't last long in that field.
I was on an interview committee for an IT position, and I had shaggy, longish hair at the time. This kid comes in, has a pretty terrible interview, but he's confident the whole time. When we asked him if he had any questions or comments, he looked at me and said, I came in and saw your hair, and I can't believe they actually hire people like you. He was probably nervous, and I think his intention was to say that he's glad we don't just hire the typical professional-looking type. Unfortunately for him, it did not come off that way.
That's a classic example of someone not reading the room. It's funny how confidence can sometimes backfire. I remember a time when I was in a similar spot, and a friend tried to lighten the mood with a joke that totally missed the mark. You just never know how people will take it. Some things are better kept to yourself, especially in a formal setting.
I interviewed a 30-year-old guy who had gotten all his previous jobs through connections. It was his first job interview ever. Although he turned out to be the sweetest, nicest, gentlest person you could imagine, he looked like an axe-murdering serial rapist, kidnapper, sex fiend, motorcycle gang member, psychopath. The dude was genuinely scary looking. He was super quiet, super shy, and was so nervous about this interview that he was sweating like crazy. Overall, he wasn't making a good impression. He said in the interview, "I know I look scary, and I'm really shy, so people think I'm a psycho, but it's not like some fucking criminal. I'm just a nice guy." He then realized that he said the F word while admitting that people were scared of him. He then said, "I imagine this isn't going very well." I ended up hiring him, and he was the best worker and one of the nicest people I've ever known in my life.
It's interesting how appearances can be deceiving. This guy came in looking rough but turned out to be really sweet. I guess we often judge based on looks too quickly. His nervousness must have made the interview even tougher. But it's cool that you gave him a chance. Sometimes the best people are the ones we least expect. People may see him as scary, but his nature says otherwise. Glad it worked out.
I interviewed a leprechaun once. He was a short, somewhat overweight guy that was of Irish descent, had red hair and a beard. He chose to wear, of all things, a green suit to the interview. It was hard to keep a straight face, especially when my interviewing partner mentioned a rainbow table cryptography and said our code was gold standard and lamented the construction going on at the Cloverleaf exit near the office.
That sounds like a wild interview. A leprechaun in a green suit definitely paints a picture. I can imagine the challenge of staying serious while talking about rainbows and gold standards. It's one of those moments where you just have to roll with it and appreciate the absurdity. Must have been a memorable conversation, though, mixing some cryptography with folklore.
When I worked in a grocery co-op, I had some interesting interviews. One really sticks out in my mind. Me, why do you want to work with our company? Him, because you guys don't drug test. Me, we do random drug testing. What makes you think that we don't? Him, this is a co-op. You guys sell weed. Why would you drug test? That's hypocritical. That's how we found out that the receiver on the loading dock was selling drugs out the side door.
That's a pretty wild interview story. It's funny how people can make assumptions. The guy really thought he had a point there. I guess he didn't expect to expose something like that. It must have been awkward for everyone involved, but at least it cleared up the situation. Just goes to show how quick people are to jump to conclusions based on what they see.
Obligatory, not my job, but my boss is the hiring manager and has a great one. He received not a resume with like bullet points and things you've done in past positions, but a first-person narrative giving an account of the applicant's viewing of the storming of the Bastille. The entire thing used flowery, extravagant language to describe the overthrowing of, 1700s French prison, but then also gave how that was very much like their proficiency at Word and Excel and their history of promptness. This was for an entry-level assistance position. Recent college grads and the like. They didn't get the gig.
That's an interesting take on applying for a job. Instead of sticking to the usual format, they went all in with storytelling. I mean, it's a bold move, but maybe too much creativity for an entry-level position. It's like trying to impress a professor with a novel instead of a straightforward essay. I get wanting to stand out, but there's a line between unique and off the wall. They learned a lesson there for sure.
I was learning how to do hiring interviews, and one candidate showed up in jogging pants. Why do you wear jogging pants for a job application? No one ever recognized that. I use it instead of dress pants because they nearly look the same. It was really a WTF situation because this is really self-confident he got the job.
That's an interesting take on job interviews. It's pretty bold to show up in jogging pants and expect to be taken seriously. I guess it worked out for him in the end. Maybe it says something about confidence and not conforming to the usual expectations. It's a reminder that sometimes being yourself can actually pay off, even if it seems a bit out of place at first.
I have a funny story about a guy we hired a couple of months ago. This guy had been working from home for a couple years and had gained some weight. He wore the suit he was married in for the interview with the senior guy here and bent over to pick up something, and his pants split down the rear. Needless to say, he got the job.
That's pretty funny. Sounds like the guy had a bit of a rough start with his wardrobe. It's interesting how things work out sometimes. He probably made an impression, even if it wasn't the one he intended. Getting hired after that shows the company's vibe, I guess. It's good he could laugh it off.
Lady showed up late wearing a sparkly tube top and year's supply of eye makeup. She talked at length about how she was fired from McDonald's because the manager kept trying to tell her what to do. She needed 40 hours a week, but could not work past 3 p.m. because of her children. However, she loathed getting up early and would therefore not be showing up before 11 a.m. for her shift. After that, I just stopped asking her questions.
Sounds like a tough situation. It's interesting how some people can be so set in their ways, even when their needs don't match the job. Staying up late and wanting to avoid early mornings while needing a full-time gig seems like a tricky balance. I guess sometimes people just need to vent, even if it doesn't lead anywhere.
IT headhunter here. One of my partners vetted a candidate. He cleared his background check and was savvy enough for the help desk job he was going for. Seemed a little off, but was overall a nice guy. Goes out to the client, sits down in the chair, crosses his legs, and grins. The first words out of his mouth are, "Do you know who I am? I've been on the news." He then tells the tale of his time in the psych ward. Apparently, he recently had his house condemned and refused to leave. When the cops tried to go in and remove him, he yelled that he had guns and would kill any cop that walks through the door. So SWAT got to go fetch him, and they put him in the nut house for a little while. Little known fact to us, certain levels of psych holds do not come up on background checks because they aren't classified as criminal offenses. He Googles all of his candidates now to make sure they haven't been on the news anymore, haha.
That's a wild story. Hiring someone who has a background like that can definitely raise some flags. It's a reminder that people can hide a lot, and sometimes things slip through the cracks, like those psych holds. I guess that's why checking references is important. You never know what someone might bring to the table, or in this case, what might come out during the interview. It's all about being cautious.
Not a manager, but I have a nice story. When I did an internship at a hospital, they hired new workers. One guy accidentally used his spam account and applied with the email, "hard body at something." The boss immediately told that everyone. Funny thing is he got the job, and now everyone calls him hard body.
That's a pretty amusing story. It's interesting how little things like that stick with people. Getting a job off an email like that is wild. It's good that he could laugh it off and take it in stride. Now he has a nickname that probably makes him stand out more than he expected. Sometimes, those funny moments really make the work environment more enjoyable.
I was doing interviews along with my manager once, and we had a girl come in. She was very confident and outgoing, which was good because it was a sales position. She was doing all right until we asked about her current job. She was a waitress in a hotel, again fine, but she proceeded to tell us about how she ran the place. She was the newest person in this small place, and she told the owners what to do. If she didn't agree with what they asked her, she'd refuse to do it. She very proudly told us all this like she was bragging to friends about the cushy job she had. Needless to say, the interview was over at that stage, and we went through the motions after that.
That's an interesting experience. It's one thing to be confident, but there's a line between confidence and overstepping. I remember a friend who got fired for something similar. He thought he was running the show at his job, but the boss didn't appreciate his attitude. Sometimes, you really need to know your place and just do the work. It makes things easier for everyone involved.
My mom has worked in HR for about 20 years. She once had an interviewee tell the story of how his childhood friend and he were playing with actual swords, and surprise, actually stabbed his friend, fatally injuring him. He then discussed the psychological trauma it left him with. He did not get the job at the daycare.
That's a pretty intense story. It's wild to think someone would share something like that in a job interview. I guess they probably weren't expecting to talk about childhood accidents and trauma. The daycare setting needs a different vibe, and that definitely wouldn't fit in. Makes you wonder how that guy is doing now. Hope he found a better place to share his experiences.
I work in a corporate office environment. I had someone come into an interview wearing red Ferrari Pumas, skinny light jeans, and an Abercrombie hoodie with fur on the collar. He wouldn't look at me. He kept looking at the ceiling. During the interview, I asked him what he knew about the company, and he said, to be honest, nothing. I saw the list of jobs posted on a board at my college and applied to all of them. Side note, I shouldn't have let this interview go on any longer. He clearly wasn't the right fit, but it was my first time interviewing someone and I wanted the practice. So I replied, "You've known for 2 weeks you were coming to this interview and didn't bother to Google us." To which he said, "No, not really. I haven't had time." This went on for about 5 more minutes and I ended it abruptly. When I was walking him back to the entrance, he turned to me. Here I'm thinking he's going to shake my hand and thank me or something, and says, "Please don't hire me if the pay is less than $$_K per year." To which I replied, "I don't think you have to worry about that." Sigh.
That sounds like an interesting experience. Getting someone in for an interview who clearly didn't prepare at all is tough. I remember a friend of mine had a similar situation with a candidate who showed up in flip-flops and board shorts. They spent more time looking at their phone than trying to make a good impression. It's awkward when you're just trying to be professional and someone isn't taking it seriously.
Okay, not a hiring manager, but the most cringeworthy thing I did in a job interview, yet was in an interview for a team leader position at Six Flags. The hiring manager asked me where I see myself in 10 years, and I told her head of operations of Six Flags Astroworld. At the time, I just got back in the US after being in Europe for 3 years. What I didn't know was Astroworld has been closed and all the rides were sold off and moved to other parks. She corrected me right away, and that was the end of the interview. I didn't get the job.
That's a tough situation. It's always awkward when you're not up to date on things like that. You think you're aiming high, then reality hits hard. At least you learned something, even if it didn't go your way. The job market can be brutal, and it's moments like this that stick with you. Just gotta keep moving forward and brush it off.
Probably tame compared to some of what I expect in this thread, but was interviewing college kids for an internship. Finished one interview. Next one was waiting in the lobby. Walked her out, and she stood there glaring at the other candidate for a solid 15 seconds. It was very, very awkward. Just a note, she didn't know it was another candidate. She just assumed.
That's a classic moment. It's funny how people can get wrapped up in their own thoughts. I remember a similar scenario when I was waiting for a job interview. There was this guy who looked super intense, but it turned out he was just lost in his own head. We both laughed it off afterward. Sometimes being tense just makes these situations feel even more awkward than they have to be.
Not cringeworthy, but sad. Had a former pharmacist interviewing for an entry-level administrative assistant position. When asked why there was a huge jump in careers, not to mention pay, he told me he was hit by a drunk driver and became addicted to painkillers during his recovery, so he didn't trust himself with the ability to self-medicate. Really made me admire his difficult choice to walk away from his lucrative career. He seemed like an honest and good person. Hope he is doing well.
It's tough to hear stories like that. Makes you think about the struggles people face behind the scenes. Quitting a well-paying job must have been a hard decision, but it shows a lot of strength. It's important to prioritize health over money. I hope he's finding the support he needs and is on a better path now. It's a reminder that life can change fast for anyone.
This was an interview for a personal banking position at a bank mart, a convenience bank within a supermarket. He was a hulking man, well over 6 foot and the build of a linebacker. His jacket looked like it came from a golfer in the 90s, like a patchwork quilt. He was sitting on the edge of his chair, blinking rapidly and sweating. A lot. I asked if he had any experience in customer service or retail, and he loudly told me, "I do not, but I am motivated as hell. I would talk to every person here, he is selling this to us like a gospel preacher. I will run to them in the aisles and ask about their banking. I will help them find what they're looking for and bring them back to the bank. I will talk to every last person here." This went on for several minutes before I thanked him for his time and told him we'd get back to him.
I had a friend who was always over the top about interviews. He once walked into one for a fast food job and started selling himself like he was running for president. He went on about how he would make the best burgers and bring joy to every customer. The hiring manager just sat there, looking confused. At the end, my friend thought he nailed it. He didn't get the job, though.
Had a guy apply for a part-time sales position. He put a few random sales jobs as his work history. We called him in for an interview. He sat in front of me and said, "I'm not here for the part-time position I applied for. I'm here for the general manager position, and that's all I'm taking." "Okay, we're done here, thanks." Number one, we weren't hiring for a GM. I joke with my GM about him secretly leaving and not telling me. Number two, you lied on your resume and job app, which means I'm not even going to look at your next apps that you put through if the spot were to be available again. Number three, you don't come in demanding a spot.
That's pretty wild. It's crazy how some people think they can just waltz in and demand a position they didn't even apply for. The way he handled it seems really off, especially lying on his resume. It just shows a lack of respect for the process. I get that confidence is good, but there's a line, you know? It's all about finding the right fit and being honest.
Not about me, but a guy in my company years ago. During his interview with the hiring manager, they found common ground in their love of duck hunting. This guy asked the manager if he enjoys duck meat. The manager confirms that he does indeed enjoy duck meat. This guy then invites the manager to duck down on his meat while gesturing to his groin area. The guy was hired, was a shitty employee for a year, then was fired after allowing too much of his personal life bullshit to affect him at work. The straw that broke the camel's back involved his girlfriend, who is also his cousin, selling all his shit while he was out of town for work.
That's an interesting story. It's funny how a casual comment can lead to a job offer. The guy really didn't last long, though. Mixing personal life with work always complicates things. Selling his stuff while he was away is a pretty low blow. I guess it shows that even if you bond over something like duck hunting, it doesn't mean you can handle responsibilities well. Sometimes it just doesn't work out.
Guy applied for a programming position, had programming in his work history. He makes it to the face-to-face stage and comes into the office for an interview. Most programming interviews will throw some basic programming question at you just to prove you know what you're doing. This guy got the FizzBuzz question, loop through 1 to 100, print fizz if it's a multiple of 3, buzz if it's a multiple of 5, and FizzBuzz if both. He was told to make a start, and just sat there umming and ahhing. So the lead dev and head of dev just assume he's nervous and try to help him walk through it, breaking down the question for him, dropping hints, etc. They get down to the question, "Okay, can you just write an empty for loop?" The guy couldn't even do that. He must have lied on his application and somehow cheated the entry test. Friend did it, Google, etc. Sadly, this happens a lot in programming. People assume it's just to do with computers, so how hard can it be? Pro tip, don't apply for programming positions if you can't program.
It's a pretty common situation, really. People think they can just bluff their way through interviews, especially in tech. I had a friend who once pretended he knew how to code for a job. When the interviewer asked for something simple, he froze. They were probably expecting some jitters, but he was completely lost. I guess it's a reminder to be honest about your skills. You can't fake your way through programming.
The strangest was probably when I asked someone to give an example of how they dealt with a conflict in the workplace. And his answer was that there was this time recently when a couple of guys were bullying him in the warehouse he was working in, or a friend of his. I can't remember. And he got his mate, who was a real big guy, to come with him and sort out the guys causing problems. This was for a call center job. Certainly a way to solve a conflict, but maybe not the guy we wanted to hire.
It's interesting how some people view conflict resolution. I remember a friend who had a similar approach. He'd call in the muscle to handle any issues at work. Not exactly what you'd expect in a call center setting. It can be funny looking back, but at the time, it had everyone on edge. Definitely makes you rethink how we handle disagreements in a professional space.
We brought in a developer a couple years ago to interview. Now we have seen some strange guys, but this one was just so far past anyone else we've had it. There was one interview where over the course of the interview he sat down in 3 different chairs and at various points had his back turned to the interviewer. My favorite though, and another guy were taking him out to lunch. To exit the building we had to go through a revolving door with 4 small compartments. My coworker gets in first, and this guy jumps into the same compartment behind him. Now, this compartment was not large enough for 2 people, so he slams his back into the back of the door and makes a loud grunting sound. I'm glad I was behind them because I almost died laughing.
That sounds like quite the experience. You don't get many interviews like that. I can only imagine the looks on your faces as that guy tried to squeeze into the revolving door. It's funny how some people just can't read the room, or in this case, the door. Moments like that make for good stories later, even if they're a bit awkward in the moment. Definitely a memorable lunch outing.
I recently had a kid who was so nervous/passive in the interview that when I asked, "Do you have any questions?" his response was, "Yes, I have one," and waited for permission to ask it. There was also this guy who was interviewing at a client site who took a smoke break mid-interview. He took the cigarettes off of an anti-smoking display the company was working on.
It's interesting how people handle pressure. I remember a friend who got really anxious during interviews. He'd prepare a ton but freeze up when asked if he had questions, just like that kid. Then there's always that one person, right? I had a buddy who would just step out for a smoke whenever the vibe got tense, oblivious to the context. It's a wild mix of nervousness and nonchalance.
I was the one being interviewed a few years ago for an office job. I walked into the room, and there were 3 attractive women in their early 30s preparing to conduct the interview. I immediately blurted out, "I've watched a lot of movies that started like this." They all laughed, and I got the job because it turns out they were looking for someone with a sense of humor.
That's a solid story. It's cool how a simple joke can break the ice. Shows how important personality can be during interviews. Sometimes, just being yourself works better than trying to impress. Plus, it's nice that they appreciated your humor. A light moment like that can change the vibe completely. Glad it worked out for you. Seems like a good reminder to not take things too seriously.
Pulled out a cigarette and lit up. More detail. This was my first job in management. I was following the boss, and this was the first interview I ever sat in on. Kid lit up, the boss just got up from the table and walked away without a word. Left me there to awkwardly dismiss the candidate. Also, another guy answered his cell phone during the interview.
It's funny how some interviews stick with you. I remember sitting in on one early in my career. The candidate lit up a cigarette right there. My boss just got up and walked out. I was left to handle the situation, which was pretty awkward. Then there was this other guy who answered his phone during the interview. I learned a lot about what not to do that day.
While part of the interview board for an open police officer position, one of the candidates told us the only reason that he wanted to be a cop was because we were hiring. He then spent the entire interview answering our questions by telling us why firefighters are better than cops. That is fine if you feel that way, but it is probably not a good idea to repeatedly tell a bunch of cops you're interviewing with that you don't want their job.
That's an interesting situation. You'd think someone would at least try to fit in during the interview. It's pretty bold to keep praising another profession while sitting in front of the people you're trying to impress. Probably not the best strategy if you want the job. I guess he didn't really consider how it would come across. Just a reminder that interviews are about making a good impression, regardless of personal opinions.
I was interviewing an older woman for an IT job with my boss. We always ask a critical thinking question. Our favorite is, give me 3 reasons a manhole cover is round. There are no wrong answers. The lady sits there clueless for a minute and says, well, my grandma is from Wisconsin and there are a bunch of pollocks up there. I looked at my boss and said, apparently there are wrong answers.
That's a classic interview moment. You expect people to come up with creative solutions, and then you get a response like that. It's funny how interviews can go sideways so quickly. Sometimes, the pressure makes people say things that just don't connect. I've had my share of awkward interview responses too, but that one really takes the cake. Makes you appreciate the unpredictability of people.
It was the worst interview I've ever been a part of. The guy couldn't speak coherently. He didn't seem to have much motivation, critical thinking skills, or subject matter expertise for the job that was open. When I asked him why he thought he would be the right candidate for the job, he seriously said, well, I've known VP's name for 20 years. We worked together at Shitty Bank, and she said I could have this job. Now I wasn't the hiring manager, but it was normal to ask other managers to interview candidates, more so to get a feel for whether they would be a good fit. When I met with the hiring manager, I said they couldn't possibly be considering hiring this guy. She just put her head down and said that VP's name made her interview the guy and strongly suggested that he be hired. Not only was the imbecile hired, but he was promoted to supervisor in about 2 months, during which time he came in, sat at his desk, and apparently did nothing all day. I put in my notice shortly after that, which had been a long time coming anyway.
Sounds like a rough situation. It's wild how personal connections can override actual qualifications. You'd think the hiring process would focus on skills instead. Watching someone get promoted for doing nothing would be frustrating. I get why you'd want to leave after that. Sometimes it's just better to step away from a toxic environment like that.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.